The streets of Harlem had heard gunshots before. Violence was not new, nor was death unfamiliar. Yet some sounds carried more weight than others, and this one cut through the neighborhood with a force that went beyond fear. It was sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably final. In that single moment, something invisible but powerful shifted, and Harlem felt it before anyone could explain it. At the center of Harlem's underworld stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, a man whose influence was built not just on fear but on control. His presence shaped how businesses operated, how disputes were settled, and how power flowed through the streets. He was not simply protected by reputation. He was surrounded by people whose loyalty had been tested repeatedly under pressure. Among them was a bodyguard, whose job was not just to stand nearby, but to act when hesitation could mean death. This bodyguard had lived in the shadows of Harlem's power structure for years. He moved quietly, observed constantly, and understood the rhythm of danger long before it surfaced. His life revolved around anticipation, reading tension in a room, recognizing threats in silence, and reacting without emotion. He was trusted because he had survived situations where others failed. Trust, in Harlem, was never given lightly. On the day the trigger was pulled, nothing appeared unusual on the surface. The street looked the same. The air carried the same mix of noise and tension that defined the neighborhood. Yet beneath that normalcy, pressure had been building. Power struggles do not always announce themselves loudly. Often, they grow quietly, fueled by ambition, resentment, and unresolved conflicts. The bodyguards sensed the shift before it became visible. Years of proximity to danger had sharpened his instincts. This was not panic. It was recognition, the kind that arrives when past warnings, subtle movements, and unspoken threats align all at once. In such moments, decisions are not debated, they are executed. When the gunshot rang out at point-blank range, it was not chaotic. It was controlled, intentional. The sound echoed briefly before disappearing into the city's constant hum, but its meaning lingered. It was a declaration that boundaries still existed, that access to power came with consequences, and that loyalty in Harlem demanded action when words failed. For those nearby, the moment passed quickly. For Harlem itself, it marked a turning point. News spread faster than sirens. Stories formed before facts. The streets did what they always did. They interpreted the event through instinct rather than evidence. Everyone understood that this was not random violence. It was a message. Bumpy Johnson's position, already formidable, became even more insulated. The act reinforced the invisible barrier between him and direct threat. Rivals recalculated risks. Allies grew cautious. Silence became heavier. The city adjusted, not outwardly, but internally. The bodyguard, however, stepped into a different reality. Once the sound faded, there was no return to anonymity. His role transformed instantly. He was no longer just a protector. He became a symbol of how far loyalty could go. His life, already defined by danger, now carried a different weight, one shaped by consequence rather than proximity. Law enforcement would later attempt to categorize the incident, framing it through reports and assumptions. But Harlem did not rely on official explanations. The streets understood context. They remembered patterns. They recognized significance without needing confirmation. This gunshot would be referenced in quiet conversations, recalled during tense negotiations, and remembered whenever power felt threatened. It became part of Harlem's unspoken history, an example of how swiftly order could be enforced when lines were crossed. More importantly, it exposed a truth that many ignored. History does not always change through speeches, headlines, or public moments. Sometimes, it changes through a single decision made in silence, by someone whose name rarely appears in records. What few realized at the time was that this moment did not close a chapter. It opened one. The sound that split Harlem in two was only the beginning of a sequence that would test loyalty, provoke retaliation, and reveal enemies hiding in plain sight. What followed that gunshot would prove that the greatest danger was not the act itself, but the unseen consequences it set into motion. The most dangerous place in Harlem was not the streets. It was standing too close to power. The bodyguard understood this long before the gunshot that changed everything. Proximity to influence brought protection, but it also attracted enemies who never announced themselves. To survive in that position required more than strength or weapons. It demanded restraint, patience, and an ability to disappear even while standing in plain sight. The bodyguard's life had been shaped by Harlem's unforgiving realities. He was not born into power, nor did he chase it recklessly. Instead, he learned how power functioned by observing it from the edges. Harlem rewarded those who understood timing, silence, and loyalty without explanation. Over time, his reliability separated him from others who failed under pressure or acted impulsively. Working alongside Bumpy Johnson meant living inside constant calculation. Every movement mattered. Every public appearance carried risk. The bodyguard's role extended beyond physical protection. He became a gatekeeper of access. Who approached, who lingered too long, who asked the wrong questions, nothing escaped his attention. In a world where information could be more dangerous than bullets, awareness was survival. Unlike the men who sought attention, the bodyguard embraced invisibility. He rarely spoke, rarely reacted, and never overestimated his importance. That humility made him indispensable. Power trusted him because he never tried to claim it. In Harlem, that restraint was rare, but loyalty came at a cost. The closer he stood to influence, the more pressure mounted. Rivals watched him carefully, understanding that weakening the shield was often easier than confronting the figure it protected. Subtle intimidation attempts emerged over time, glances held too long, rumors whispered, threats implied but never stated outright. These were tests designed to measure resolve. The bodyguard recognized those signs. He had seen men fold under less pressure. Some disappeared quietly. Others made mistakes that cost them their lives. Survival depended on reading the city's undercurrents and adjusting before danger fully surfaced. Harlem never warned you twice. As Bumpy Johnson's influence expanded, the risks multiplied. Power attracted challengers who believed history was ready for change. They underestimated how deeply control had embedded itself into Harlem's structure. They also underestimated the people willing to protect it. The bodyguard became more than security. He was continuity. He ensured that routines remained uninterrupted, that appearances projected stability even when tension simmered beneath the surface. Stability itself was a weapon. It discouraged reckless action and delayed confrontation. Yet beneath that calm, the bodyguard sensed something shifting. The balance he had spent years maintaining felt increasingly fragile. Conflicts were no longer isolated. Alliances blurred. Trust thinned. Harlem's familiar patterns began to fracture. This was not a sudden realization. It arrived gradually, through accumulated details, a look held too long, an unexpected absence, a silence that felt deliberate rather than cautious. Experience told him that moments like these preceded irreversible change. Standing closest to power meant accepting responsibility for decisions no one else wanted to make. When threats escalated beyond negotiation, hesitation could undo everything. The bodyguard understood that protection sometimes required decisive action, even when consequences were unavoidable. The streets did not reward mercy. They respected certainty. And certainty, in moments of crisis, often came at the expense of peace. As pressure mounted, the bodyguard faced a reality few acknowledged openly. Loyalty was no longer theoretical. It would soon demand proof. Not in words, not in presence, but in irreversible action. What made the situation even more dangerous was the illusion of normalcy. Harlem continued to move. Businesses opened. Conversations flowed. Life appeared unchanged. But beneath that surface, forces were aligning toward confrontation. The bodyguard knew that when the moment arrived, it would not announce itself dramatically. It would come quietly, suddenly, and without room for reconsideration. Survival instincts sharpened, awareness intensified, every second felt heavier. He remained at his post, knowing that stepping away was not an option. Distance would not protect him. Silence would not erase his role. Standing close to power meant accepting whatever followed. The streets were watching. Rivals were calculating. Allies were waiting. And somewhere within that tension, a line was about to be crossed. What the bodyguard did not yet realize was that the next test of loyalty would not come as a warning, but as a moment that would force him to choose between restraint and irreversible consequence. Loyalty in Harlem had always been spoken of as a virtue, but in reality, it functioned as a currency. It was measured not by intention but by action, not by promises but by sacrifice. For the bodyguard, loyalty had long been a quiet commitment, expressed through vigilance and restraint. That understanding would soon be tested in a way that transformed loyalty into something far more dangerous. By the time tension reached its peak, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. Power structures that once felt immovable had begun to strain under internal pressure. Rivals grew bolder. Boundaries that were once respected started to feel negotiable. The city's underworld sensed vulnerability, and vulnerability invited challenge. The bodyguard stood at the intersection of these forces. He had witnessed the slow erosion of restraint among those seeking influence. He understood that violence rarely emerged without reason. It followed patterns, fueled by desperation and opportunity. What concerned him was not the presence of threat, but the certainty that someone would act on it. This certainty reshaped how loyalty functioned. It was no longer enough to stand guard or anticipate danger. Protection demanded readiness to act without hesitation. In Harlem, hesitation often carried consequences more severe than violence itself. As the situation intensified, the bodyguard's role evolved beyond defense. He became a decision-maker, forced to interpret danger in real time. There would be no opportunity for consultation, no reassurance from authority. The responsibility rested entirely on his judgment. What separated this moment from countless others was its immediacy. The distance between threat and response collapsed. The space for reconsideration vanished. Years of experience narrowed into a single, unavoidable conclusion. When the trigger was pulled, loyalty ceased to be abstract. It became physical, irreversible, and defining. The act itself was swift, but its meaning stretched far beyond the instant it occurred. It was not fueled by impulse or rage. It was shaped by obligation and survival. That sound carried weight because it represented a boundary enforced. It announced that certain lines could not be crossed without consequence. In Harlem, such declarations were understood instantly, even if never spoken aloud. The aftermath unfolded quietly at first. Shock did not manifest as chaos, but as silence. The bodyguard absorbed the weight of his action in real time. There was no celebration, no relief, only awareness. Awareness that everything had changed. For those aligned with power, the act reinforced stability. For those who opposed it, the message was unmistakable. Calculations shifted, plans adjusted. The balance of fear and respect recalibrated itself. Yet loyalty as a weapon carried its own cost. The bodyguard's identity shifted irreversibly. He was no longer simply a protector. He became associated with consequence. That association followed him into every space, visible or not. Harlem responded, the only way it knew how, through adaptation. Conversations shortened, movements became more deliberate. The city absorbed the event into its collective memory, using it as reference rather than spectacle. Behind the scenes, new tensions emerged. Violence resolved one threat, but it exposed others. Those who remained quiet were not necessarily at peace. Silence often concealed calculation. The bodyguard sensed this shift almost immediately. He understood that decisive action rarely ended conflict. It transformed it. What had once been direct became subtle. What had been visible moved underground. Loyalty had achieved its purpose, but it had also altered the landscape. Power remained intact, but it was now surrounded by quieter, more patient adversaries. The danger had not passed, it had evolved. Standing at the center of this transformation, the bodyguard recognized a harsh truth. The act that secured loyalty in the moment also ensured permanent scrutiny. There would be no return to obscurity, no escape from consequence. As Harlem adjusted to its new reality, unseen forces began to move differently. Retaliation did not always announce itself. It waited, it observed, it learned. What the bodyguard could not yet see was that the loyalty he had proven so decisively had awakened a threat far more patient and far more dangerous than the one he had stopped. After the moment of violence passed, Harlem did not erupt. It adjusted. That was how the streets had always responded to sudden shifts in power, quietly, cautiously, and with a heightened awareness of consequence. The absence of chaos did not signal peace. It signaled calculation. Everyone understood that something irreversible had occurred, even if few were willing to speak about it openly. Rumors moved faster than facts. They slipped through barber shops, back rooms, and street corners, reshaped with every retelling. The details mattered less than the meaning. The story was not about who fell or how it happened. It was about what the act represented. Boundaries had been enforced, and the streets recognized enforcement as a warning rather than a resolution. Those closest to power grew more guarded. Familiar faces became cautious. Movements that once felt routine were now deliberate. Harlem had learned that moments of silence often followed decisive violence, and silence was rarely empty. It carried intention. The bodyguard noticed the shift immediately. The streets spoke differently now, not through confrontation, but through restraint. Eyes lingered longer. Familiar nods disappeared. Trust, once assumed, now required reassessment. He understood this pattern well. When the streets whispered instead of shouted, it meant that new strategies were forming. Power, while still intact, began to feel heavier. Influence no longer rested solely on fear. It relied on anticipation. Those who opposed it did not retreat. They recalculated. They observed weaknesses not in strength, but in routine. Stability, once reassuring, became predictable. Law enforcement presence subtly increased, though rarely where it mattered most. Official attention followed surface-level disturbances, never fully penetrating the networks that governed Harlem's deeper currents. The streets had learned long ago how to adapt to scrutiny without revealing intention. Meanwhile, those who had benefited from order feared disruption more than confrontation. Stability kept businesses running and conflicts contained. Violence threatened predictability, and predictability was profit. Quiet pressure mounted from unexpected directions, urging restraint even as resentment simmered. The bodyguard found himself navigating a more complex environment than before. Protection was no longer about immediate threat. It was about long-term perception. Every action, every movement, risked being interpreted as provocation or vulnerability. What unsettled him most was the absence of visible reaction. Those who would normally test boundaries remained distant. That distance did not suggest fear. It suggested patience. Harlem had always respected patience more than aggression. The streets began to remember, not loudly, but persistently. The gunshot became a reference point rather than an event. It shaped how future risks were evaluated. It lingered in decisions made far from public view. As whispers replaced confrontation, the balance of power subtly shifted again. Control remained, but it no longer felt absolute. Influence now depended on foresight rather than force. The bodyguard recognized this evolution. Violence had closed one door while opening several others. He understood that the streets never forgot, even when they appeared calm. Memory in Harlem functioned as a ledger, recording actions and waiting for opportunity. The question was not whether consequences would arrive, but how and when. In private spaces, plans began to change. Alliances were reconsidered. Neutral parties weighed advantage. The act that once reinforced order now served as justification for future ambition. Everyone interpreted it through their own lens. The bodyguard sensed isolation growing. Not abandonment, but distance. Protection had turned into a barrier. The closer he stood to power, the further he drifted from certainty. Trust narrowed, assumptions dissolved. The city continued to function, but the rhythm felt altered. Harlem moved forward with caution, aware that silence often preceded disruption. The calm that followed violence was never peace, it was preparation. As days passed, the absence of immediate retaliation lulled some into false confidence. Others knew better. History in Harlem had taught them that delayed responses were often the most calculated and damaging. The bodyguard remained alert, understanding that the most dangerous threats were rarely visible. They emerged when attention faded and routine returned. He waited, knowing that the streets were not finished responding. What no one could yet identify was where the next move would come from, or how deeply the whispers had already taken root beneath Harlem's uneasy calm. Every act of violence carried a cost, but not all costs were immediate. Some unfolded slowly, revealing themselves through isolation, pressure, and irreversible change. For the bodyguard, the true consequences of pulling the trigger did not arrive in the moment itself. They surfaced afterward, in the quiet spaces where certainty once existed. In the days that followed, Life continued outwardly unchanged. Harlem maintained its rhythm. Streets remained busy. Familiar routines resumed. Yet beneath that surface, the bodyguard felt the weight of his decision pressing inward. The act had solved a problem, but it had also created a new reality, one where his presence altered the atmosphere of every room he entered. He was no longer just a protector. He had become a reminder. To some, he symbolized loyalty taken to its extreme. To others, he represented risk, escalation, and unpredictability. That dual perception followed him constantly, shaping interactions without a single word being exchanged. The burden of consequence manifested subtly at first. Trusted spaces felt less secure. Familiar faces offered less reassurance. Silence replaced conversation. In Harlem, silence often spoke louder than confrontation. It signaled reevaluation. Power structures remained intact, but the illusion of invulnerability weakened. Those who depended on order grew uneasy, not because it had collapsed, but because it had been enforced so publicly. Enforcement drew attention, and attention invited scrutiny. The bodyguard understood that survival now required more than vigilance. It demanded emotional restraint. Regret had no place in this world, but reflection was unavoidable. Every decision from that moment forward carried amplified risk. There would be no margin for error. What troubled him most was the shift in expectation. Loyalty had been proven once, but expectations rarely diminished after proof. They expanded. The act had established a precedent, and precedents demanded consistency. He realized that restraint might now be interpreted as weakness, hesitation as betrayal. Harlem's underworld had a way of redefining identity. The bodyguard felt that transformation occurring in real time. His past actions faded behind the weight of one defining moment. He was measured against it constantly, even when no one acknowledged it directly. Meanwhile, pressure emerged from unexpected directions. Those who benefited from stability quietly urged caution. They feared escalation more than threat. Violence solved immediate problems, but it destabilized long-term arrangements. Influence depended on balance, and balance felt increasingly fragile. Law enforcement attention lingered longer than anticipated, not overtly aggressive, but persistent. Observation replaced intervention. Patterns were studied, movements noted. The bodyguard recognized the danger of being predictable under scrutiny. Routine became a liability. As days turned into weeks, the emotional cost deepened. The certainty that once guided his actions gave way to vigilance shaped by consequence rather than anticipation. Protection felt heavier. Responsibility grew lonelier. The streets continued to whisper, but now those whispers carried sharper edges. Some questioned whether the act had gone too far. Others wondered how far it could go again. Both interpretations were dangerous. The bodyguard understood that pulling the trigger had not ended a threat, it had shifted it inward. The greatest risk was no longer external confrontation, but the slow erosion of trust and stability. The city had not rejected the act, but it had not embraced it either. History in Harlem was unforgiving toward those who misjudged momentum. Violence could secure power temporarily, but sustaining it required foresight. The bodyguard sensed that foresight was being tested. He began to realize that loyalty, once weaponized, could not easily be set aside. It followed its own logic, demanding reinforcement. Each act raised the stakes for the next. As Harlem adjusted, the bodyguard faced a growing awareness that survival would now depend on navigating consequences rather than preventing threats. The line between protector and liability blurred. The cost of pulling the trigger was not bloodshed, it was permanence, the inability to return to a life defined by quiet vigilance rather than visible consequence. What the bodyguard could not yet anticipate was that the greatest price of his decision was still ahead, waiting for the moment when loyalty would be tested not by action, but by endurance. Power had always thrived on perception. In Harlem, it survived not just through control, but through the belief that control was effortless. After the gunshot, that illusion began to fade. Influence remained, but it no longer felt untouchable. The bodyguard recognized this shift immediately. When power lost its illusion of inevitability, it invited challenge from directions that were once unthinkable. The city's underworld entered a phase of quiet reassessment. Those who once deferred without question began to analyze patterns. They looked for fatigue, for overextension, for signs that enforcement had become reactive rather than preventive. Power still stood, but it now required maintenance. For the bodyguard, this meant adapting to a landscape where certainty no longer protected him. His role expanded beyond guarding physical space. He now guarded perception. Every appearance had to project calm without provoking fear. Every absence risked being interpreted as vulnerability. The pressure was relentless. Protection turned into performance. Stability had to be displayed, not assumed. The bodyguard understood that maintaining power without illusion demanded constant awareness. Harlem respected strength, but it punished complacency. Behind closed doors, influence was being renegotiated. Some alliances tightened, others loosened. Neutral parties explored advantage quietly, testing boundaries without overt confrontation. The city's power map grew more complex, layered with caution rather than confidence. Law enforcement scrutiny intensified in subtle ways. Surveillance replaced force. Observation replaced intervention. The bodyguard felt this presence even when it was invisible. Power that once operated in shadows now moved under watchful eyes, forcing adaptation. The absence of immediate retaliation created false comfort for some. The bodyguard knew better. He had seen how patience functioned as strategy. Delayed response often carried greater precision than impulsive reaction. What unsettled him most was how quickly people adjusted. Harlem did not mourn illusions. It adapted without sentiment. Once the belief in effortless control faded, survival instincts recalibrated. Every decision was now measured against long-term consequence rather than immediate gain. The bodyguard sensed isolation tightening around him. Trust narrowed further. Even allies began to maintain distance, not out of fear, but caution. Proximity to consequence was risky, and risk demanded calculation. Power without illusion was heavier. It required constant reinforcement, constant visibility, and constant restraint. One misstep could undo years of control. The bodyguard felt the strain of carrying that responsibility without acknowledgement. The streets continued to move, but the rhythm felt slower, deliberate. Conversations were careful, movements measured. Harlem was thinking, not reacting. That awareness made the environment more dangerous than open hostility ever could. As weeks passed, the bodyguard realized that the act meant to protect power had exposed its vulnerability. Not weakness, but dependency. Control depended on consistency, and consistency demanded endurance. He understood that the next threat would not arrive with aggression. It would come through pressure, attrition, and time. Power could withstand violence, but it struggled against exhaustion. Standing closest to influence meant absorbing that exhaustion firsthand. The bodyguard felt it in every calculated decision, every restrained response. Survival now required patience equal to loyalty. The city waited, not for revenge, but for opportunity. Harlem had always known that opportunity emerged when certainty faded. What remained unseen was how long power could endure without illusion, or how close it already was to testing the limits of endurance itself. The most dangerous adversary in Harlem was never the one who announced itself. It was the presence that remained unseen, patient, and observant. As weeks passed without open retaliation, the absence itself became unsettling. Violence usually provoked response. Silence suggested calculation. The bodyguard understood that something was forming beyond immediate sight. Harlem's history had taught a consistent lesson. When enemies stopped pushing openly, they began repositioning quietly. The streets did not forget power shifts. They studied them. Every pause carried intention. Every delay hinted at strategy. The bodyguard sensed the shift through subtle changes. Familiar patterns dissolved. People who once lingered now passed through quickly. Spaces that felt predictable became unpredictable. The city had not grown calmer. It had grown cautious. This invisible pressure was harder to manage than direct threat. There were no confrontations to prepare for, no warnings to intercept. Protection relied on anticipation without confirmation. The bodyguard operated within uncertainty, knowing that reaction time would be minimal once intent revealed itself. Power structures adjusted defensively. Influence tightened inward, reducing exposure. While this preserved stability temporarily, it also created isolation. Isolation limited information. The less power saw, the more vulnerable it became to miscalculation. Law enforcement presence remained steady, watching rather than intervening. Their silence mirrored the streets. Everyone was waiting. No one wanted to be first. The bodyguard recognized that the enemy did not need to strike directly. Pressure alone could erode certainty. Rumors, financial strain, shifting alliances, these methods dismantled control without bloodshed. They were slower, but more effective. What made this phase dangerous was ambiguity. There was no clear direction of threat. Everything felt potential. Every interaction carried risk. The bodyguard's instincts remained active constantly, leaving little space for rest. As time stretched on, the cost of vigilance accumulated. Fatigue threatened clarity. The city's patience tested endurance. Harlem respected those who lasted, but it exploited those who faltered. The enemy's restraint began to reshape behavior. Decisions became conservative. Movement restricted. Opportunities declined. Power remained intact, but it was no longer expanding. Stagnation replaced growth. The bodyguard understood that stagnation was a warning sign. Influence that stopped evolving invited replacement. Harlem did not tolerate emptiness for long. He began to realize that the true objective was not confrontation, but erosion. If power could be made uncertain, loyalty would weaken. If loyalty weakened, protection would fracture. This enemy did not need to step forward. It thrived in invisibility. It waited for exhaustion, impatience, or misjudgment. Time was its weapon. The bodyguard felt the weight of this realization settle in. The greatest threat was no longer physical, it was psychological. Maintaining readiness without relief strained even the most disciplined minds. Harlem continued its quiet observation. The city had chosen patience over urgency. That choice alone signaled danger. As days turned into months, the bodyguard recognized that the situation was approaching a breaking point. Something would eventually force movement. Silence could not last forever. What the bodyguard could not predict was who would break that silence first, or how devastating the cost of that first move would be. Time moved forward, but Harlem never truly moved on. The gunshot that once cut through the air had long since faded, yet its presence lingered in ways that were harder to define and impossible to erase. It lived on, not as noise, but as memory. Memory shaped behavior, expectation, and belief. In that sense, the sound never ended. The city adapted, as it always did. Power reconfigured itself. New arrangements formed quietly. Old tensions dissolved into different shapes. From the outside, Harlem appeared stable again. Businesses operated, streets filled, life resumed its familiar rhythm. But beneath that rhythm existed a deeper awareness, an understanding forged by consequence. For the bodyguard, life settled into something resembling normalcy, though normal no longer meant what it once did. He remained close to power, but distance defined his inner world. The act that had once demanded immediate resolve now demanded endurance. Survival was no longer about reaction. It was about lasting long enough to be forgotten by time. He understood that history rarely remembered those who stood between moments. It remembered outcomes, not intermediaries. Yet intermediaries carried the heaviest burden. They lived with decisions long after the city absorbed them into myth. Harlem did what it always did with defining moments. It simplified them. The complexity of pressure, timing, and consequence faded behind narrative. The gunshot became symbolic rather than specific. It represented order enforced, boundaries defended, and loyalty proven. What it did not capture was cost. The cost remained personal. The bodyguard felt it in restraint, in caution, in the constant calibration of movement and presence. He lived within the echo of his decision, knowing that nothing he did afterward could exist independently of it. Power, too, bore the mark of that sound. It survived, but without illusion. Influence became more measured, more cautious. Expansion slowed. Control prioritized sustainability over dominance. The city had learned that enforcement carried exposure, and exposure invited risk. The streets remembered, not loudly, but precisely. Future challenges were shaped by the precedent set that day. Boundaries were tested differently. Loyalty was measured more carefully. Violence became less frequent, but more calculated. What emerged was not peace, but equilibrium. Harlem settled into a balance defined by awareness rather than fear. The sound that once split the city had recalibrated its instincts. The bodyguard recognized that his role in that moment would never be publicly acknowledged. That anonymity was both protection and erasure. He had shaped history without owning it. That was the paradox of proximity to power. As years passed, newer figures rose. Older ones faded. Stories shifted focus. Yet the underlying lesson endured. History did not change because someone spoke. It changed because someone acted when silence offered no alternatives. The gunshot had done more than stop a threat. It revealed how fragile stability truly was, and how easily it could be reshaped by a single decision. Harlem continued forward, carrying that lesson quietly. The city did not glorify the moment, but it did not forget it either. It lived on in caution, in calculation, in the way power moved without spectacle. For the bodyguard, the sound remained internal, not as regret, but as awareness. Awareness that history often turns on people whose names dissolve into shadow. Awareness that loyalty, once proven, could never be undone. The city survived. Power endured. Life continued. But beneath it all remained the echo of a moment that reminded Harlem of a truth it never questioned again. And even decades later, whenever power shifted in silence, those who truly understood Harlem wondered whether history was preparing to repeat itself one sound away from changing everything again.